and Applefest have organised this evening's event. We are really honoured and delighted to have as special guests Professor Gerald Mills from UCD in Dublin, who has kindly and generously given of his time to come down here this evening to Clonmel to talk to us about his special subject. Gerald Mills is an Associate Professor of Geography in UCD. He is an expert on the many values of trees in towns and cities. Having completed a PhD in the United States of America on that subject, he's an expert on the urban environment, especially how cities affect climate, both locally, regionally, and on a global scale. His team recently completed work on Dublin trees with some very interesting results, which we hope may have some relevance to leafy or not so leafy Clonmel. Gerald's going to talk for about half an hour, and he's delighted to take questions, and we'll have a bit of a conversation afterwards. Just before I hand over to Gerald, I want to thank all those involved in organising this evening's event, particularly my fellow Suircan members. Thanks to the OPW for helping us use this wonderful venue this evening, and everybody else involved. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Gerald Mills. Thank you, Gerald.
Good evening, everybody. As Alan said, my name is Gerald Mills. I'm a geographer. I'm a physical geographer, which means that I'm mostly interested in the natural environment, but my application is entirely inside urban areas and cities. So I have a particular fascination with the places we occupy. Most of my focus is on the climates. In other words, I'm interested in how streets are designed, access to light inside buildings, including the planting of trees, because of course they also regulate the climate. So that's my interest. But it's clear when I started undertaking this work that the interest in trees completely links together with lots of other neighbourhood groups who are interested in the spaces they occupy. So I'm going to talk about the value of trees in towns and in cities. And 30 minutes, I'm going to divide it into three parts. The first part will be very general, an introduction. The second part will tell you about some of the work that I did with colleagues in Dublin, which I think in some respects they match because, I mean, what's a city but a lot of villages all jammed together. So a lot of the issues you're facing here are the same issues that they face in communities in Dublin. And then I'll do a brief analysis of the tree stock in Clonmel using a simple tool that's accessible to everybody. So I'm going to start out with what really the tree is all about, which is the leaves, because that's the connection. That's the connection between the atmosphere and the soil, which is hiding beneath all of this paving. So there's one vision of the street. This is a beautiful street. This is Garden Street in Dublin. Not a tree to be found. You have to go to the very end before you get to it. Now, here's the thing about the street. It was almost designed precisely not to have any trees on it because of the dimensions of the buildings. Notice how the windows all get smaller and smaller the higher up you go. The idea was to allow light into these buildings. And here's a working class area in Dublin, and lo and behold, you never get trees if you live in working class areas. They were never put in. So these spaces were obviously never designed for cars, which you're supposed to walk to work or take a horse and cart. But increasingly these streets are now being used as parking lots. But you can see it's utterly and totally barren. Nothing living on it at all, apart from the people inside the houses. So a big change has happened in how we think about cities now, and how we consider what we often refer to as green infrastructure. And it's an interesting term. It's like an engineering term, in the same way that you have pipes and you have roads, you have buildings. But there's no reason why vegetation can't perform some of the functions. So they refer to this as infrastructure. So I've given you a few examples of the type of infrastructure that people talk about. On the left-hand side is an ivy-covered building, which obviously provides some protection from the outside climate to the indoors via that little envelope of green. Green channels are part of what people refer to as sustainable urban drainage systems. In other words, rather than necessarily have a piping system, what you do is you incorporate the capacity of greening to do some of the work. Because if you think about a city, not only for a town, we've utterly paved it. That means all the rainwater that arrives here has to be got off as quickly as possible. So not surprisingly, cities and towns experience flooding associated with rainstorms because on occasion you get storms that the system can't cope with. We've created an entirely made-up river system below our streets that accommodate all that water. Green paving, it's ideal for parking lots where there's not a lot of heavy movement. Essentially, you incorporate bricks to give it some sort of structure, but you allow vegetation to grow. Now, the big thing about these things is they suddenly collect the atmosphere with the soil below. They operate as ways of distributing water when it comes out of the atmosphere. In other words, they're an effective way of doing hydrological management. And here's a famous picture from a building in Chicago. Chicago is probably the city's adopted this idea of green roofs. This is City Hall. You notice that City Hall only occupies half the building, so only half the building is green. Now I have big problems with these types of green because it's on top of a skyscraper. I think even the birds need a lift to get up there. So they offer very little value to people actually living in the streets. Their value chiefly is to people who live below the roof. Here's another street in Dublin. Quite a grand street. This is the Dawson Street, very close to Trinity College. Now, here's what trees can really do in a way that, say, green spaces, gardens cannot do, because they are structured vertically. That means that all those blades of grass that you see on a lawn, they're suddenly all organised to form a sort of architecture. And here you can see it's extremely congregated space. It's occupied by people, it's occupied by the tram, it's occupied by buses. It's a major bus route for everything crossing over the river, and cars. So the trees, I think, offer an opportunity for a little bit of nature inside that space. Now, question. The arrangement, question the species, but it actually forms a nice line along its path. And by the way, most of the tree is planted alongside the road and alongside what is an electrified track. It's entirely possible to do so if you decide. This poor tree is gone. This is on UCD campus. In fact, the picture I showed you at the outset of the chestnut leaf, that was the last time. Last time I came out of my office, they tore it down because they're putting up a building. It was a gorgeous tree. It's older than the campus. It's older than the state. And it's just an amazing amount of work. From the atmospheric point of view, they provide shade. Now, we talked about this earlier. In certain summers here, sometimes shade is good. Shade is useful in lots of different ways. It's done strategically because it can actually protect the inside of buildings also. Probably more important, I think, in Ireland is this idea of shelter. Winds actually obstruct the airflow, and in doing so, they slow it down. So they can be a very, very effective way of managing heat loss from buildings, managing, for example, airflow between streets. They can offer cooling because fundamentally, every one of the leaves is a minor air conditioning system. Because it's got thousands of openings on it, which are stomata. The plant controls it. So the plant opens and controls the stomata when it's actually doing work. And in doing so, it releases water vapor to the atmosphere. Where does it get the water from? It gets it from the root system buried below the ground. So these are the pieces of magic of the tree. The more of these they have, the more work they're doing. When it's open, it's doing business. They breathe in all the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxides, the carbon monoxides that are coming out the backsides of the cars. Because it's a surface, all the particulate matters that come out the back of cars, which includes tiny bits of metal, tiny bits of soot, a lot of them start to accumulate in leaves. In fact, if you went out with the wet tissue someday and you went along these streets here, you'll often find that they're coating. So, having caught it means it's not in the atmosphere. If it's not in the atmosphere, it's on this surface, that means it's not breathing coming into people's mouths. In fact, if you look at how we have to build cities and put them together, we do a very strange thing. You put traffic lights where everybody gathers to cross the road. And that's the same place that all the cars gather who are stopped at that point. We almost create a little fumigation channel. All you need now is allow tall buildings, small spaces, little wind, and lo and behold, you have a perfect environment to pollute people. They intercept rainfall. Now you might not think that's a big deal, but that means that if you do get a big rainstorm and you've got lots of tree canopy cover, they effectively slow down the delivery of water to the system. That means they control runoff, and of course they also manage soil erosion. I'm not going to talk a great deal about it, but if you want to have a biodiverse urban area, you need diversity.
Did you say what plant or what leaf is in your hand there?
That's one of those ones, one of the planes I just picked off the tree.
Oh, right, okay.
Like any creatures, the variety of ecosystems you provide means you get greater diversity. So the more tree species, the more different heights, the more different shapes, the more they're linked together. In other words, you don't have a single isolated tree, you have lines of trees, you have clumps of trees, the more biodiversity you get. So back to the leaf. And those are the stomata, which are on the leaves, they're actually doing the job. So the more leaves you have in the tree, this is often measured in terms of what they refer to as the leaf area index. If I were to pluck all the leaves off a tree, lay them out horizontally so that they all are adjacent to each other, and then divide it by the plan area of the tree seen from above, that's what we call a leaf area index. The bigger the index, the more these devices are on the tree doing the work. This happens to be a lovely tree, sycamore, which is on the UCD campus also. How do you know what a tree is up to, what it's doing? Well, what you're looking at when you look at the skeleton of the tree, you're looking at about 1/2 carbon, 1/2 water. And when it's in operation with all the leaves on it, these are deciduous trees, they're breathing in carbon and they're storing it. So there's two processes here. One is what they refer to as sequestration. The plants, when they're engaged in photosynthesis, take in the carbon. And they do that annually. So every time the leaves get shut off the tree, a lot of the carbon is then stored in the root skeleton. So we have carbon stored, and then we have carbon sequestered. The older the tree, the more mature it is, the healthier the tree, the more carbon it sequesters, and the more it stores. So there's certain critical measures to take for the tree to find out what it's up to, and what it's been doing over the past 30, 40 years. One is you measure the canopy dimensions, the height of it, the crown size, etc. It's a very good indicator of how it's doing. A critical measure, by the way, is the diameter of breast height. What you do is you go to a tree and you put a measure tape around the centre. And that is an extremely good measure of the amount of carbon stock that's stored inside that tree. So the older the tree, the fatter the trunk, the more carbon is stored. The older the tree, the more mature it is, the more of these, the more it's taken in on an annual basis. It's that simple. If you knock down mature trees and you replace them with baby trees, they do nothing. And they won't do anything for another 10, 20 years. Now, it costs an awful lot to plant a mature tree. So recovering the effort associated with a mature tree by replacing it by a small tree is not worth it. You have to wait 30 or 40 years for the benefit. Now, you can do this estimate yourself. I did it with an example of a deciduous tree, a fairly dense tree like beech, maple or ash. There's about 700 kilograms a cubic meter of dry wood in a cubic meter. So you can do a calculation based upon that diameter of breast height. So I took the idea of me being a tree hugger and how much I can put around a tree. That comes to be about 51 centimeters in terms of a diameter. That would translate into just over 2 tons of solid carbon. Because carbon is a relatively light molecule, if it were carbon dioxide, in other words, if you were to ignite it and convert it to CO2, that's about 8 tons of carbon dioxide, one tree. But remember, you only get those benefits if the tree is between 25 and 30 years old. That's when it really kicks in. So replacement value really has to take into account some sort of a long-term strategy of that order. Now, keep that in mind because we've just made commitments on the Paris Agreement. They're going to kick in 2030 and 2050. So we're well within the time frame when this stuff has to actually kick in. So, I picked a number of trees here. This is my colleague Keena. He did the original measurement of a lot of the trees in Dublin. And the reason he's in each of the pictures there is because we used him to figure out the dimensions of the tree. And then he'd take measurements. And the great thing about trees in cities is they're vertical. That means you don't have to give up a lot of space because what they do is insert themselves within paving and connect themselves to the ground below. So, as we say already, if you plant the right tree in the right place, you can take a lot of the work off air pollution control. That's not to say they have an easy life. Urban trees get battered. This, of course, is a Dublin bus tree, because every time the bus goes by, whack, it goes, and that's why it's such a peculiar shape. And of course, if you think of them as infrastructure, that means they have to be maintained. That means they need proper emplacements in order for the tree to grow to the maturity that you want it to do so. They will lift up the trees, but so what? Shops get burgled, we fix them. Anything that happens inside a city is constantly maintained. In fact, in my examination with the community that I'm going to talk about in Dublin, that's the main issue they had. All they wanted was decent maintenance. And that again just means a strategy. It might mean that a tree needs to be chopped down, but you have a long-term strategy in place that you know something else is going to come along to take up the slack. So it doesn't become a hit and miss every single time, get rid of trees, then replace them. I'll give you an example. All the pollution associated with cars is concentrated along the roadway. If you were to look at yourself in a car, your biggest source of air pollution is the car in front of you, because the exhaust pipe of the car in front of you is very close to the intake for your car. So you are going to get the most air pollution. After that comes a bicyclist, and after that becomes a pedestrian. So you can imagine, it's hard for you to see here, a sort of dome of pollution around the road, and the further you are away from that dome, the lower your exposure. So how could plants help? Well, they can help by taking out some of the pollutants, but they're only part of the strategy. Fundamentally, if you want to improve air quality, you have to reduce traffic. Another way you could do it is simply by widening the pavement or putting in trees to screen out this. By the way, the worst air quality is usually around about knee height. So again, think about crossing the road. If you have a child in a buggy, that child is at the perfect level to ingest all the exhaust fumes. So strategies for protecting don't have to just consider above the ground, they might also consider what's happening close to them. There's a big move at the moment worldwide to plant lots of trees. So for example, in North American cities where there's been systematic problems associated with greening, a lot of the cities are now planting 1 million trees. That's their measure. And of course, cities are always trying to beat each other. So some of those cities are going to plant 2 million trees. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues who are agriculture said this is ridiculous, because what's going to happen is you're going to get 1 million saplings growing up, and they're all going to die at the same time. In other words, as a strategy for greening places, for making pleasant environments, this is not the way to go. What's required is a long-term management system that doesn't talk about individual trees, but actually talks about all the trees as though they were part of a forest. It's just that the forest is interspersed with buildings. It's a big deal in North America, where they actually put a price on every single tree, and they connect the tree value back to all sorts of other effects, and they put a money on it, right? So this is what distinguishes the Americans from the Europeans. The Europeans talk about the value of a tree from all sorts of emotional backgrounds. The Americans simply put a value on it. The value is, in this case here, this tree pays us back $3,695. They slap it on the tree. So they basically cost everything. And they have all sorts of strategies at different levels for planting trees, but they fundamentally link issues of trees back to issues of health and issues associated with air quality. So this brings us to the idea of the forest. Now, I'm a physical geographer, so the one thing I do is I do lots of mapping. So I took on a task of trying to compare, for example, just how green the cities of Ireland were, including Derry, Belfast, Dublin, Limerick, Galway, Waterford. And I call this the sort of fingerprints. Now, in order to compare each of the places, because here's the problem, they're all different sizes. So Dublin has lots of green spaces, it also has lots of places that are completely barren. What I did was I just put a circle of the same size over every place. That way, you compare like for like. So, there's Belfast. I'm going to say Belfast is a stone, with next to no trees in the centre of Belfast. Over here we have Cork. Cork is quite green, but look where it's not green, it's in the old port area. The same thing is true of Galway. About half the city is completely barren, that's the old port. Then you have Waterford, The medieval city was practically no trees, all the trees were on the outskirts. There's Limerick. Limerick is quite strange because Limerick's got these beautiful boulevards, all commercial, but there's not a single tree on them. All the trees are just over the other side of the river in the suburbs. And there's Derry, which is very green. The only parts that are really barren are the bog side and the water side. And after that, it's very green. And I did it for Dublin. Now, Dublin actually is quite green if you go out and take in the entire area. But if you look in the city centre, it's actually got relatively few trees, except for the ones that are clustered places like Trinity, which most dogs, I don't think, have ever gone in the gate. In other words, they don't regard it as part of their space. Merrion Square, Stephen's Green. And I compared Dublin against other cities around the world, and you see considerable variation. So, for example, the greenest city here is Helsinki, by a long shot. So many of these cities actually have a deliberate strategy is to make them greener and to plant more trees. So this was the inspiration for a big project that I did, which was to map out all the trees in Dublin. And the way we did this was I cooperated with students, became their job, and we basically identified every tree inside the city centre. So that's about maybe, the city is about 100, or a bit less than that, about 90, no, it's 100 square kilometres. And we counted 300,000 trees inside the city. I linked that data to some other data I had, which told me elevation. What you're seeing here is the heights of trees. You see, it's very, very hard for me to visit and identify all those 300,000 trees. So you have to have strategies which involve sampling, are going to visit some trees, not others. But this provides me with a map of the heights of trees, which is a very good indicator of the size and maturity of the trees. And this, by the way, is Phoenix Park, which has got some of the oldest tree stock in the country. And much of it is actually clustered, so it actually does make a forest. And Dublin is blessed to have that on the doorstep of the city centre. So again, green depends on how big you draw the boundary. I could arrive in Clonmel and say, well, it's extremely green, I can see green. That's not necessary to say that I can actually get to the green or use that green. So the reason we did this project was to find gaps. So here is a map of all those trees across the city. I'll just use a few code words here because many of you may not know the city. One of them is Leafy Dublin. That's Leafy Dublin. That's Bald Bridge, all the way across Templeogue, Turnier, the entire south side of the city. There is an area on the north side, Clontarf, St. Anne's Park. And then you have areas that have relatively few trees, extending from the city centre out along that axis there, out toward town. It's got a very distinctive geography. And part of the reason I did this was to find out where the gaps were so people could make coherent arguments about why their space should have more attention. So everything you see there in black there is the community that we're working with, which is an area of the city called Inchicore, sort of old working class Dublin. And they argue that they need more green spaces. Now, in fact, in terms of trees, they're okay, but in their case there, they argue there was no spaces for children to play football. Now here's the thing, one of the big pushes, of course, is to make the city more occupiable. So there's a lot of issues going on at the moment regarding housing. A lot of the new buildings in the city are all high, tall buildings, lots and lots of apartments. But there's no compensation. You're given no private space, but there's no compensation outside by providing accessible green space. The place I point out is, if you ever get the chance, if you didn't know the city, you would swear that part of the world was the city centre, because the building going on there at the moment, the height of the buildings, the close to the buildings is simply astonishing. It's the old port area of Dublin. And apart from along the River Liffey, there's not a single tree planted in the entire city. Now think about it, it's hard. It's next to where the ocean's going to rise. They're going to have problems in the future unless they take issues associated with greening seriously into consideration. So I did some basic mapping. I looked at population statistics, which I can get from the census. They also tell you where people work. So Dublin City is quite interesting because there's about 1.5 times as many people in the city during the daytime than there is at night time. And then we figured out how many trees you got. So I compared different parts of the city. So for example, for the entire Dublin City Council area, if I leave apart Phoenix Park, you get 0.41 of a tree per citizen. I did calculations for the area that I identified in black there to show that they were deficient. Now the reason why we did this was because we wanted to try and give a community the tools basically to take on the fight. And they wanted to improve their space. And improving their space wasn't just to do greening, it was also got to do with traffic. So here's all the traffic that goes into the city. Not surprisingly, it all gets congregated toward the centre, it all gets pushed down certain streets. So this is also where all the emissions are coming. So if you have an area that's barren, there are very few trees, very few green spaces, but you're also subject to all this traffic coming in, they felt they were hard done by. So the strategy was not simply to look at trees, but also to look at general improvement of the urban environment. And what they wanted was effectively somebody to provide them with the information in the same way that the county council had information. They wanted an expert that would deliver them the information so they could have the fight. So, in the end I produced maps like this. This map shows in red where all the carbon, which is a very easy one to measure, is coming out of cars. So you can see they all form lines because that's where the cars are. And the areas that you see in green here is where the carbon's been taken back out of the atmosphere. So you can see the park over on the left-hand side. So there are areas where stuff has been generated and stuff where it's been taken out. And they're quite close to each other. Now here's the thing. If I took all the trees in Dublin, all 300,000 trees in Dublin, and calculated all the carbon that they contain, remember they've gathered that over maybe 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 100 years, they would equal 1 year's emissions of cars. You cannot solve climate change, you cannot solve issues of air quality by looking at trees. Trees can offer redemption, but I'm afraid they don't give you forgiveness. You're still producing this stuff. So we did a calculation. So for example, what do the trees do? Well, in the DCC area you can see they're responsible for taking in 608,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. And then we did calculations based on the traffic input and output. They're about the same. As I say, the trees have accumulated over years, but the traffic is producing it in just 1 year. And then we did one extra thing. And this is a very important thing if you want to know about the services of trees. You actually identify the trees. You visit them. There's not that many of them. We have an app that's free to download where citizens can go out, identify a tree, and tell you its species and tell you anything else about it. So, for example, this is the area of Inchicore. This is all the information we gathered from all those pieces of information that citizens have gathered using that simple app called Curial. So, we also had a conversation with the community, and during COVID, of course, we had a unique opportunity to find out what people thought about where they lived. We engaged with an artist, and this is her work. And what Shodine did was she asked people to basically take the path. During that period where we're all confined within 1 kilometre of our homes, take a path and tell us about your path. So she mapped out routes of people. Of course, what she discovered were a lot of people found that there are local environments that they were stuck within. When you were told a kilometre, the assumption was you could do everything you wanted within that kilometre. Well, many people found that the areas that they occupied were not interesting. They had no variety at all. So out of this work we developed this prototyping. As I said, the idea was that we would provide the community with all the same information that planners would have so that the fight was equal. And interesting, when we actually talked to people about greening, about green spaces, climate change wasn't the reason. What they identified over and over again was health and well-being. They like going out and walking in green spaces. They like streets that had trees on them over streets that did not have trees. And they also raised governance, the looking after of the infrastructure is key. So, this is the third part. Now, when I speak to Alan, I indicated that what I do is just do a brief assessment using this piece of software that you would have seen previously when I did Dublin and Derry and Limerick, just to find out what the tree canopy cover was within content, buildings, paved roads. In other words, what you've left over is the space that we use for all sorts of things. It just happens that most of the landscape around is covered by fields, and that's why you get some rich grass. Trees occupy, as I say, about 2 square kilometres of the 10 kilometres that make up the settlement, and that's the tree cover. Now, what iTree does is it makes assumptions based upon the tree cover as to what the work is that's being done. So this is what it estimates in terms of carbon. Remember I said carbon is one of the easiest ones to do because carbon dioxide exists naturally. So it's relatively easy to figure out how much carbon is stored simply because that's what the tree is. It's either water or carbon. So on an annual basis, about 616 tons of carbon sequestered taken in, stored about 15,470. And here's the Americans, they put a value on it. They put the value of the storage at over €4.5 million. And the sequestered value they put down at €182,000. They do the same with everything else because in America they have air quality is tied directly to health. So there's a carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, PM2.5, PM10, and ozone. These are common pollutants you find around the world. So this is its estimate of what those trees can do. Remember, it's only an estimate, what they can do in terms of those pollutants. And they put a value in each one of them. And then they do one last thing, they tell you the amount of runoff that they offset based upon the canopy. And you can see, in terms of kilolitres, they estimate 32,000 kilolitres offset with a value amount of about 60,000 euros. So they actually put a value in it. So that's where I'm going to finish up. You notice that I only focused on what I regard as the physical properties of these without considering all the other aspects. But I can assure you that if I were to map, as we've just seen the trees in Dublin, where you get trees and where you don't get trees usually correspond with all sorts of socioeconomic differences in the city itself. It's like the city has a memory and the tree planting, green spaces are all embedded in it. They just keep coming back. If you see trees as infrastructure, then you treat them like infrastructure. That means planting, maintenance, and it means a long-term strategy. You don't put in a piping system saying, oh, 10 years' time, that was the wrong piping system, let's tear it up and put another one in. You actually have long-term goals in order to achieve. And the one thing that the arboriculturists always tell me is you get the right tree, you plant it at the right time, and you put it in the right place. So if you consider all those things together, why you're doing it, choose the right trees to do so, have a long-term plan. That might mean harvesting at some stage, but also means routine planting, not like chop everything and start from scratch. And I'd ask you just to think that if you believe the time frames, I'm a climatologist, these time frames are real. 2050 is what we're talking about in terms of our commitments. It's going to be absolutely radical, the changes are going to be needed. And I hope the greening of our city environments is part of it. Now, I've just told you, trees can't do everything. They can't take out the carbon we're producing. But if you looked at the indirect benefits, one thing we found out during COVID is opportunity to use outdoor spaces. If people have pleasant outdoor spaces, then they won't be indoors and the demand in heating won't be as great. If we're clever about the planting of trees, we can have all sorts of indirect impacts on how we decide what type of places we want to occupy. I picked out what I think Dublin City has done quite a nice job of whenever they find these little gaps, these little spaces, to plant the wildflowers and little bit of trees. I mean, seriously, it doesn't take an awful lot of effort simply to make the place look like a neighbourhood rather than just a functional environment for cars. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Gerald, thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed for a fascinating talk. The size of the audience tells you how important trees are to people of Clonmel. And I think that your talk has highlighted a whole lot of other benefits that we probably haven't even thought about on top of the psychological and emotive ones that you just came to at the end. I'd like to take a seat so that we can throw some questions at your standing. And I'm going to start off with a question, and then people from the audience, I'm sure, will have questions to put to you. But you mentioned the very interesting phrase that comes up a lot in discussion about trees, which is the right trees in the right place, or the other side of it, the wrong trees in the wrong place. But from listening to you, it sounds like that's a much more complicated and nuanced issue, and perhaps there is no such thing as the wrong tree in the wrong place. Or is that the case? Because we have obviously got a cohort of trees here that are in various states of health, which are performing functions, but some of them are causing problems. So how do you answer the question of what is the right tree in the right place versus the opposite?
Well, I guess if you start out with a vision as to what you want to achieve. So that's a good starting point. So you can plant trees to offset cars, in which case you might choose particular trees that are resilient, that could stand the environment in that regard. They might not turn out to be the grandest trees. For example, there's one street in Dublin, a very famous one called Bagot Street. They're going to chop down all the trees in Bagot Street. It's a lovely street. The trees all grow out around the median. And at their full height, they actually turn the entire street into one big room. There's also a lot of traffic going on there. So from the point of view of, say, for example, air quality management, it's a bit of a disaster because the trees have effectively sheltered the entire space. They've created a perfectly good room for all the pollutants that they look at. But I'd argue the problem is the traffic and not the trees. That once you've decided that, the tree is there. I don't mind, say, for example, there's occasions where trees have to be chopped down because if I'm being blunt about it and I treat it as infrastructure, that means sometimes trees just get too big for the space. They do lift up the roads. They do tap into local water mains, and lo and behold, well, I don't have it. So you do have to remove them. It's just it always seems to be a constant fight that you have to start from scratch. And that's the part I think we're always finding ourselves in a loop. We end up fighting around individual trees rather than actually having a healthy urban environment, which would always have trees of different types. And that means trees get removed, yeah, but we don't remove it and then start the planting. I mean, I'll give you an example. I got me in a bit of a fight. It was about Dublin bus cargoes. I don't know if you heard about it.
Yeah.
So you have the National Transport Agency in Dublin Bus decided that to tackle climate change, they needed more public transport. But the problem was, of course, public transport wasn't offering people an efficient way to get to the city. Solution: we widen all the streets. There's only a few streets that you actually enter into in Dublin. Nobody goes down the back roads. And some of those streets are some of the grandest streets inside the city. Like along the South Circular Road, the North Circular Road. These are actually very nice streets. So in order for them to meet a climate change objective, they were going to take out the roads, to take out all the trees. Now nobody ever did a count of the number of trees. So one evening, myself and a colleague simply counted the number of trees in the corridor and found out that not were they going to lose 1,000 trees, but they're probably going to lose 5,000 trees of these magnificent trees. What I found fascinating was that here was a group fighting on the basis of climate change for a more efficient system, but the way they fought for it was they wanted additional space for the buses and the cars and the cyclists. That meant widening all the roads and basically creating this thoroughfare. So you had some of the older streets doing most work in the city, and lo and behold, they're the ones going to get chopped. So what did they argue in response? They said, oh, well, don't worry, we're going to plant those equivalent trees inside the parks. Now, the park people wouldn't stand up and say it, but I know they said this is complete garbage. We plant trees in park for a particular reason. We don't want something to be told, by the way, stick another 5,000 trees in there. Plus, you're going to knock down trees that are hundreds of years old, and you're going to replace them with these saplings. It was absolutely quite, as you ended up with two sides of the debate, both arguing for climate change, pleasant environment, but at different scales, and causing these conflicts. So I don't necessarily say there's always a wrong tree in a wrong place, but I do accept that if you treat it as a principle, that everybody has access to green spaces, everybody has access to spaces that are well looked after, governed, green, and all the rest, then you might need to harvest on occasion, but there's this long-term strategy.
Thanks.
By the way, you know, the biggest complaints I got, the work I did, which went into the Irish Independent, were from the cyclists. The cyclists gave out to me for counting the trees.
North Zurich, London included, and you know, there's a well-established day tree of hornbeam. There's 17 species that we know internationally from different cities. I know they're not all similar in comparison, but isn't it a well-trodden road? What is the right suitable tree for north and south of where I just talked about?
In general, there isn't. It's only about, look, we did Dublin and we looked at the street trees. There is only about 7 street trees that were planted. However, they do have a problem with the planes. The planes are huge when they get going. The chestnuts are huge, and that's why you tend to see them shift toward other types of trees. You go around Dublin, I swear that if you see a cherry blossom, you know all that housing estate was built in the 1960s. You never see cherry blossoms anymore. You go into the apartment complexes now, and there's a form of hornbeam that goes up that my friends refer to as a hipster tree. It only appears now in that environment. You're right. The trees that survive are hardy, resilient, but they do get awful big. That means they do have to be taken down. But why do we plant more of them? Why don't we have a regular routine where the stuff gets removed at the same time we plant it? So we, as I say, have a long-term strategy. That'd be my point.
Can I just say to the sap nursery, you know about sap, don't you? Would you? Sap nursery near here.
Oh no, I don't know the company.
Anyhow, they produce trees at 22 feet. Which is buying time to buy them.
Yeah.
It's terribly expensive, it sounds like it.
Oh, yeah.
You know, 150 to 200 per tree. That's cheap, you're buying time. For replacing trees and not going for the small ones, if it has to be done, why not go for those? They can plant them in obviously the disturbance at the planting stage. But that's a very quick way of replacing semi-mature trees and not just that.
Yeah, except that, I mean, most county councils don't want to take on the burden. They don't want to do that. Anyway, trees are often regarded as an afterthought after the planning process is finished. Then we just sprinkle in a few covered beaches or something like this. It's also an attitude change. I mean, my mother always gives me out with leaves. So I think the problem with our cities and towns is they often don't grow up with the population. So when attitudes change, I think the types of places we should occupy should change. If, say, for example, people have less interest in going to these mega malls and big shoppings, well, then we just need to change the town accordingly, not keep repeating the same thing over and over again.
Would you have an opinion on Arlington trees here in Clonmel?
Yeah.
The first time I actually saw them, I saw the little red ribbons on them. I'm very familiar with the red ribbons throughout all of Dublin, along those major routes. I always think trees, no matter what, I always think tree is beneficial. So I don't know the specifics about the plan they had in mind for this and what they were trying to achieve. But for me, having vegetated areas within a town are critical. Now, I don't think Clonmel is overburdened with trees. In fact, when I walk around the other streets, most of them are barren. In fact, most of the trees that I found looking at the satellite image are all on the edges. So I'd imagine that one of the most richest areas of trees is in fact the graveyard, just for walking around. But in the town itself, there was an awful lot of parking space. There was an awful lot of big warehouse type buildings. There was lots of parking around that. But I didn't get the impression that it was overly burdened with trees. Sorry, I can't be more specific because I don't know what the plan was.
Now, can people put their hands in the air if they'd like to ask a question, and we can give you a microphone? Right
Yeah,
here.
thank you. As part of a project I did in 2017, we looked at old maps of Clonmel, and we found out, to our astonishment, that pretty much every car park in the town used to be an orchard. And also the park across the way, the Nisbrook Park, used to have almond trees in it, and all kinds of. So there was a huge variety of trees.
Look at the name of the town itself.
Yeah.
There must be beehives here.
Yeah.
Biodiversity, absolutely.
So just to go back to the plan for the street, I think the idea is to blanket cut down all the trees, and I think that is where our objective is, that we want them to keep the trees that are healthy and that look like they're healthy, and there's plenty of room to plant more. And I think the argument to plant only the one variety, which I think is the plan, is, we feel, possibly problematic. And I think from what you have said, a mixture of trees is actually more recommended. Is that correct?
Yeah, variety. Now, there's an awful lot of private gardens. So usually a lot of the species variations found in the private gardens. That was my experience in Dublin. You get an awful lot of variety there. But the street trees always tend to be the same types of trees. So that means they're planted for specific purposes, and they're hardy. But the challenge is to get the right mixture of ages and the right mixture of species. But all you're doing is basically providing for the car all the time. I think this is the challenge we're going to have to face. Even if we have electric cars and we don't have the air pollution problem in quite the same way, we still have the brake pads, you still have the tyres, still have a lot of stuff. It comes down to how you allocate space. Right? So how much of the space in this town is used for car parks and roads for vehicles versus how much is used for pedestrians? That's the fight.
And in the management, sorry, coming into the management here, like the brilliant example, after learning something tonight, right here, during your feet, at the rate of traffic, at this time of night, it's not that. It's a lot worse than I would expect, because I live in the country normally. They planted a lot of hybrid around Nash, with magnificent berries, bunches of berries, that everybody was enjoying. The material of their value, generally speaking. Along comes somebody and puts them into a shape just to tidy things up. So they won't produce a flower or a berry for 3 more years after being butchered by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. So it's a management, it's a lot to do with caring for trees, elderly people. Not engineered, I'm not engineered in part of any tree.
Well, it depends what type of engineer. There are a lot of engineers who are environmental engineers who are perfectly. So it all depends on the training and what they see as. They also have very restricted budgets about what they can do. And let's face it, the easiest thing always to solve a problem is to build a wall, do paving, and not engage in anything that may be slightly different for fear of the consequences.
Gerald, a question from Fran on the left.
Thanks, really interesting presentation, and really enjoyed it. I actually know some of the urban spaces in Dublin, Mulvey Road and those areas,
Yeah.
you know. The yellow ribbons I think they have up there. Yeah, and poems
It's
and
red and black, it's red.
yeah, poems. So Alan needs to up again there, you know, there's a high standard set in Dublin. And I love the way you've done the accounting and that, really, really nice, really neat. Could you talk a bit about integrating surface water management within this? And you talked a little about carbon, and there's a lot of talk, you know, in the government sector, this is where I work, in terms of multiple benefits, and I hear it's a lot, and yet, you know, it actually translating to reality is a different matter. And you know, to bring in, let's say, for example, to be clever about it, if we can, looking at biodiversity as well as your surface water management, as well as the climate sequestration, can that all be done, and can that be integrated into kind of a strategy that then will be funded? Because this ultimately comes down to resourcing in terms of how local authorities manage their budgets, and this is a challenge that we have in this whole area. So I suppose we're going to keep surface water management number 1, and then biodiversity number 2.
Can everything happen together? Well, to some extent it does naturally, right? If I say, for example, pick the graveyard, there's something where all that stuff is together. I guess that would depend on what I was trying to solve. For example, when I look at, say, flooding in Dublin, I look at the places where they've had flooding in the past. So they have a history of it. And usually it's got to do with the indentation in the landscape, so that the system can't cope with rainwater erupts. So that requires a specific design for that kind. Invariably, I find the places that flood in Dublin have the fewest amount of trees. So yes, I believe that you can manage both those things together. I think the biodiversity, we have less experience in managing that. Because the usual way they assess the biodiversity, as I can see, is they just talk about habitats. So for example, if you look at Dublin's biodiversity plan, it consists of Phoenix Park and Bull Island. And the real challenge for them is to incorporate those biodiversity ideas into the town and city. Now, I think citizens have a big role to play in biodiversity, because half the trees, as I can see in Dublin, are actually private gardens. Now, we have schemes for the protection of the rural landscape, we have schemes for REP schemes to protect. I don't see any reason in the world why we can't apply the same sort of reason to neighbourhoods, so the neighbourhoods can not become part of the problem. In Dublin city centre, when they do have floods, the city managers always tell me the problem is that people have paved their lawns. In other words, areas that were meant to provide some sort of buffer are gone. Again, I would look at all sorts of tax opportunities to allow people to actually retain the green spaces outside. There's enormous capacity in this country, especially the car park spaces, for replacing paving with SUDS type systems for those big flat areas. But I think it's going to be a mix on the gathering things, depending on where the problem is. I don't think that's a generic answer. So I've seen examples elsewhere, in other parts of the world, where they've a major driver, and it might be the flooding, where they have a clear pathway. But what you're describing is something where you want to achieve multiple goals, air quality, water quality all together. I think it's probably easier to do, say, for example, in Clonmel than it is in Dublin, where you have real areas like Stony Park, for example, which is entirely paved, and it's also on a slope. So it must be just a great delivery into the river.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because like we're literally sitting on the River Shore SAC, which, you know, alluvial woodland is one of the qualifying interests, so to try and integrate that back into the urban space here, I think it's doable. It's just a matter of thinking around it and actually getting on it.
I do think we missed an opportunity that people, say, I know the gardens. I was amazed when I looked at the stuff for Dublin, at the amount of green space that were in people's back, and they're all connected to each other. So they made all those goals for biodiversity, but they're never in any biodiversity plans.
Gerald, two questions. Paul first, then Noel. Paul.
It's on, is it? Yeah. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. It is sort of tragic, isn't it, that there's such a division between the planners and the people. I don't know of anybody, I have never met anybody who said it would be an excellent idea to cut the trees in Clonmel. Yeah. And yet the planners, who were of goodwill and trying to do the best they can for the sake of the geometrics of the non-humanistic plan that they seem to be putting into place, want to cut the trees, and that's as far as one gathers, almost all the trees on the two main streets. And you know, that's far more worrying than cutting trees, at least to make room for buses. There's a purpose in it, but this is cutting trees because they claim the trees will spoil the geometric lines of this design, on which something like €12 million was going to be spent in a town that displayed the traffic that I think Alan has organised, because I wasn't aware of any traffic in Clonmel. There's tumbleweed mainly on the main streets after 5 every evening. There is no business in Clonmel. It is now going to a wonderfully geometric pavement and street lights and street seats without any trees. I just wonder if you had ideas how we can bring the planners and the people spending such huge sums of money in a very small town back to dealing with the people and listening.
I don't know if I do. All of my experience is that data, information should be freely available, because I often find the discussions are lopsided, because one side has all the information, the other side doesn't. And I think that makes it extremely difficult to put together a coherent argument that fights back. So, for example, if they've done an examination of trees to indicate they're not healthy, well, I would expect to see a list of the trees, a list of the issues, etc. Because I think it's an uneven fight. My experience with planners are very well intentioned, because they're doing it obviously for what they think is the betterment of everybody. But they don't often have the tools, because there's never part of their training to actually interact with citizens. I think we need a different framework for what you describe as participatory planning. I don't think the current consultancy system, where there's something out there, take comments, is necessarily working. So my experience has been that if I have as much information as the council has, then I can challenge them on information that they accept as being valid. And I would always urge that, for my money, information is a power, and if you don't have that information, it's very hard to make the challenge. So, yeah, free data, publicly available data. I mean, part of the argument about the work we were doing in Dublin was to balance the argument, because the community did not want us necessarily to advocate for them, but they want to have the information presented in such a way that they could make the argument most effectively, because they knew the spaces and they knew what they wanted. And there's no point me getting in the way and telling them what they wanted. I'd better off telling them this is what you don't have, and this is what you don't have.
Thank you. We have the microphone for Noel, please.
Thanks very much on that speech, very informative. I'm part of a group here in the town forum, along with Alan and others, and listening to the plans for the re-landscaping of the main street. Basically, the car is still king. The car, that's the first priority. The car has to be facilitated in terms of movement. And if you look at, most of us have been to European cities, they have a great sense of social spaces, and if COVID has taught us anything, it is the importance of social spaces and the greenness of them. I live in a village just outside here called Marfield. One of the things I noticed during COVID is the huge numbers of people coming out to walk in those green spaces, because the green spaces are not available in our town. And the second thing that planners seem to love is pouring concrete. Case example is if you go up to Cherrymount, where the exit is out of Cherrymount, they've poured twice the width of this area of concrete when they could have greened some of it. Obviously you need path, but you don't need that. So car and concrete are the two. And in terms of consultation, what I find is what I call token consultation. We have consulted the public, but as you say, the importance of providing the public with information. And what I'd like to ask you is, each council at this stage obliged to have somebody who's looking at trees, horticulture, landscape in their planning department?
No.
Rather than just hardcore engineers?
Well, Dublin just appointed its first arboriculturist.
Yeah.
First.
Right.
Dublin doesn't know where the trees it planted are located. So it's organised around the parks, and then there's the street trees. It's quite an interesting division. Basically, it's between the space that is public, that's what the civics is about, what you just described, where you would expect the council to invest. Versus stuff that's private in people's backyard, where I think people should be helped to basically make it more productive. But in those spaces you're describing, the city itself has no idea what it planted. So this individual is currently basically looking at the trees that the city has planted. They've got no record of it. The only record they have is the record I gave them, which is embarrassing. That we have, you know who owns the building, right? So why would you not know anything about the trees that you actually put down? But that's Dublin, and Dublin is really proactive about this now because of the climate change agenda, the biodiversity agenda, the walkability, all those things, the 15-minute city idea, and that's it. I don't see any equivalent in Cork. I know Limerick has started, Limerick County, to gather the information, to actually start mapping out where the trees are.
I just think the importance, and I think your project in Inchicore highlighted it, the importance of engaging the citizens. Even in mapping the tree space in the town, it raises awareness. I mean, even getting people, like Alan got tonight, people to come here, it has raised all of our awareness. We're all going away.
Yeah.
And I noticed in talking to council officials, the big issue when you're suggesting ideas about maintenance. And if it is maintenance, they don't want to hear about it. What can we put in that won't be, that's literally maintenance free? And that seems to be the project. I'd be interested in asking, because like a debate went on about O'Connell Street in Dublin when they were putting in the spire and redesigning that whole public space. And if you remember, there was trees there. There was a huge argument about taking them out and putting in the tree canopy they now have. What were your observations on that and looking at it now and then?
Well, actually I don't remember. Strangely, a lot of that cutting down happened before I went back to Ireland. So I don't remember those trees are quite the same way, but I've seen pictures of them and they formed immediately. And they argued at the time that because they're all the same species, they're all dying at the same time. The ones they replaced actually have come into their own. I don't particularly care for the trees because that means the entire centrepiece is now empty of trees. You just have the statues and then the things around the side. Well, let me put it this way. I think O'Connell Street is a desperate street. Because you can O'Connell Street here, every city has one. supposed to be the primary street in the city, and an awful lot of buildings are either derelict, fast food joints, and it's not a pleasant street really. Now, I could give you lots of other beautiful streets in the city, which are lovely.
Feeling, and I think that you've given us an awful lot of information that will further embolden us and galvanise us into making sure that we get a better final solution.
Obviously, the place should be designed for the people who occupy, right? That's the key, right? So, the planning, the engineering is all designed for the health and safety of people who occupy the space. That's the bottom line. My guess is in the parameters for the redesign, there are no parameters there with regard to tree quality. So not surprisingly, they got left out. When I discovered when I did the bus cargo stuff, that Arab, who was given the contract, one of the biggest engineering companies in the world, were never asked to count the trees. Now, that's astounding, isn't it?
Yeah.
They were never asked to simply, so the only time it really mattered was when they were interfering with private space and knocking people's gardens off, and then there was serious money involved. The trees didn't matter, they were simply irrelevant. They were things that you could plant anywhere in the city. In fact, the counter-argument was because it's carbon, because carbon's in the atmosphere anywhere, it doesn't make any difference where you plant the trees. So you might as well sort out the carbon problem here by buying a forest in Brazil, because it's all carbon, and just weighing one against the other. But they were never asked to consider it. Now, I don't know that I can blame the engineering firm. The fact that it was such a myopic view of the possibility, and the fact that the people who run the bus system didn't think about what the implications would be on the Russians, I found astonishing. And the fact that the bicyclists, because finally they were getting a bit of space on the road for themselves, they objected to the fact that I indicated these trees were cutting down. I found that amazing. So you had all these people ostensibly doing the same thing for the same reasons, and yet they were all in abject conflict with each other.
Thanks, Gerald. Back left.
Hello, Alan. Yeah, and you kind of beat me to it. There are a lot of town centre redesign projects happening in across South Tipperary at the moment, and I'm aware of one particular public realm enhancement project where the planners and the engineers have told public representatives that their hands are tied by the design specifications, the guidelines, and I think maybe that's where, as you say, you've kind of said that trees aren't featuring at that stage, so you actually have to go back to your.
Yeah, they have to be there as part of the original.
Yes.
No one would say, well,
Yes.
we're going to knock down that building. Nobody would say that. But they would knock down the tree.
Another question from left. And then right.
Thanks very much for your talk. You mentioned leaf area index. A mature chestnut tree with the girth of a metre, say 8 metres high. Can you just tell us what is the area of the leaves? I have an idea what the answer is, but and it's quite astonishing that you can create such a vast area. A tree can create such a vast area within its footprint.
I don't know offhand. I would imagine that the leaf area index is up to 20 or 30 times the size of the planter of the tree.
I understand it's 2.4 acres, nearly a hectare.
Acres, okay. On top of
Nearly
a tree.
a hectare.
Yeah.
Can I say something about the
Can you repeat that?
I understand, but
The question was a mature tree, if you plucked all the leaves off and spread it out on the ground, what area would they occupy?
But that is your leaf area index.
That is the index is simply the plan area divided into that. So it tells you how many times surface is actually exposed. That's
Which
all.
is the same figure.
Yes.
I understand it's 2.4, nearly a hectare for a mature chestnut tree.
Per tree.
Per tree.
For a mature chestnut, which is a big fellow.
Sorry, I'd just like to clarify as somebody from Cork that we do care about trees. Now, we did have to cut all the elm trees on the Mardike, as mentioned in the song, because of the Dutch elm disease, and we've cut most of the other trees. But we have invested several €100,000 in artificial trees. You can't sit under them or do anything else under them because they're like flat boards, but they do breathe in and out in carbon dioxide and out oxygen.
Yeah, I thought that was just that was like a equivalent of virtue signaling, because if you think about it, the only way it could work is by sucking the air toward it. In other words, the sit-on meeting would be to expose you to all the worst air pollution because we simply draw this stuff in. The interesting thing about Cork is Cork has this area that Cork is developing. That's the area that's actually fairly barren. Any trees there are by happenstance and not by planning. So there's large sections of Cork on the south side that I think are well worth vegetating.
But I mean, that actually makes the point. We all want to live in leafy suburbs, not because of the effects of the biologic effects of the trees, but because of the beauty of them.
Well,
And
I actually like
the streets.
Yeah.
And,
well, I like living in cities. I don't want to live in a park. So I like, but I don't see why it's one or the other. So for me, it's about, say, for example, having pocket parks, because the interesting thing about walking around town is to go different paths to the same place. So some path might take you by trees, some maybe none, maybe there's a park there. It is a diversity of the urban environment. It's entirely in our hands. And unfortunately, homogenized. And that means everything is treeless, barren, and lack of greenery. I mean, do you think birds are going to hang out with these pots of flowers? They're not, right? You're not going to get by diversity by having those little things. You need a strategy. So those are like, for me, they're after all the other stuff is in place.
Now, have we any more questions before we begin to wrap up?
Yes,
Question there.
very quickly, you started off with, sorry, you did start off with the chestnut. I was quite shocked at that, given that there's only 3 insects associated with it as opposed to 600 and whatever with the oak. So it does make up for it by having the more poles for barn owls, which are seriously in trouble in the last 50% decline in the last 100 years. So that's one thing that saves the chestnut, apart from by playing conference as well. Anyhow, I wanted to say just 2 minutes from here, there's a beautiful mature cork tree. And in fairly recent times, the last remaining earth surface around it, the council have gone in and put a nice deep layer of you know what. And it has an awful smell of fresh tar. Now, I don't know how long more that tree is going to stay alive. I don't know what the effects of tarmac has on the roots of the tree, but it can be good. It's lovely to walk on, and it's made for more cars. More cars, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, you're finished.
Front left microphone for Noel, yes.
Given you have been involved in looking at green spaces in cities and towns, and obviously by the attendance here tonight, there's quite a few people in Clonmel who would be interested in looking at their town and its environs in terms of increasing that green space and biodiversity. What would you suggest as a roadmap of approaching that and working out a plan that would link to dialogue with local officials and so on?
Well, I can only tell you about my experience again. I think it's impossible to get away from the fact that we just need the information. If you don't have the information, you can't tell me. That means every tree inside that's been planted that we should know about. It should be a personality. If you go to parts of London, every tree is given a number, and any residents can check out what's happening to that tree. So there is a maintenance issue, but it's a matter of shifting the maintenance away from certain types of things to other things. So I think data, information is the fundamentals. That's what I think. But that might be my own opinion.
When you say collecting data on trees in the urban environment, are you talking about data on trees in people's gardens as well as the public spaces?
Well, I start with public spaces because I feel that's where everybody pays for taxes. So that means that you expect to have a decent urban environment to occupy. Now, the challenge is, and this is the challenge associated with Dublin Bus Connects, who does the place belong to? Does it belong to people who live there? Does it belong to people who come in there? Does the person who comes into shop have the same right for a pleasant green space as someone who actually lives there? I think there's a challenge. The other challenge we're going to face eventually is the private, the public part. Because there's an awful lot of green infrastructure that in people's gardens. Now, I think we should support them to develop that, but that's where the battle's going to be. Because if you want to have a green space, it's going to require cooperation. But I do think the biggest frustration I had, it took me 12 years to put together the data for Dublin, right? It stops and starts. And the reason I wanted it was because I was interested Because I can get information on buildings. It takes a lot of work, but you get information on buildings. Well, I was interested in how the city affects the atmosphere in the streets, above the streets, all the pollutants of Dublin, where do they end up? Do they end up over where? That's where I was interested. Now, you cannot study cities and leave out what is a big, big three-dimensional part, which are the trees. So that's why I needed to gather information on that. Distribution of pollen around the city. That would require information on the trees. Information on the green spaces, access to green spaces. Do you have a right, as a citizen, to a portion of green space within a given diameter? I think that's not an unreasonable proposition. The strange thing you find in Dublin is that there are large communities that have very little green space nearby, but it actually has a public transportation system, so it could take you out to the ocean, it could take you down to the river, it could take you to the park. Often you find the places that have least access to green spaces are actually in rural towns, because the town hasn't provided green space, and all the green space outside is simply inaccessible to you. So you end up with the strange thing that there's only limited walks you can do that can experience that type of environment. You can see in the distance, but you can't actually get to it. So you're confined, then you have to take a car to go for a walk in the mountains, rather than having it on the doorstep. I just think we need cities and towns that represent the types of environments we want to occupy.
Gerald, thank you very, very much for a talk that has, above all, taught us the values of trees, not just the American dollars, but the many other values that we probably had never thought about. And that obviously is on top of the emotional connection that the people of the town have for the trees. And it's very interesting that you have actually addressed the three aims of our local campaign group. And interestingly, we have a date with the Director of Services on the 1st of November, when we will be presenting three requests. And you've answered the first one, which is to achieve an external review of the value of our trees. And that's hugely important, because we haven't had that. The second thing that we've asked for, and you've addressed it too, is the need for the employment of experts, a biodiversity expert or an arborist on the staff of the local authority. Because that lack has led to much of the problems that you've outlined. And the third aim of our group, and again you mentioned it, is a strategy. We don't have a tree strategy in the county development plan. It was promised in the last version of the plan, but it hasn't happened. And as you said, if there's a plan and a strategy, then so much of this can be factored in to good future planning. So I think I speak for everybody in wishing to congratulate you on being so clear and so unafraid in giving us your views on this. And just before wrapping up and so on, I want to thank everybody for turning out this evening. I want to thank the staff, all the people who've helped with the filming and the recording. And there's a bucket going around just for a donation to thank those who've given up their time for the recording and the filming and so on. But I'd like to end with a big round of applause for you, Gerald.